You stand in a stone-paved courtyard as dawn begins to rise, with the smell of olive oil and damp wool drifting through the air, and the scrape of leather sandals echoing beneath the colonnade. In the steward's hand, a wax tablet still bears fresh marks. Beside it, a signet ring presses into the cord with the force of an order that never needs to be spoken loudly. Early light touches the dust of lime on your shoulder. And in that instant you understand. In Rome, fate begins with status. This empire asks a cold question. Under the same roof of power, why do citizens and slaves live such different lives? Roman law drew its first great boundary between the free and the enslaved, and the whole social order rested upon that divide. Citizenship, meanwhile, carried legal privileges, lawful marriage, contracts, and public standing, granted by the state as calculated rewards. Even when some slaves could build a small personal fund, their freedom still had to pass through the will of a master and the hand of the law. On the same street, beneath the same grinding wheels and morning cries of the market, two men pass one another without entering the same world. One bears the dignity of citizenship, the other belongs to the household property of his owner. Rome's true question was not merely who was richer, but how legal status could shape the entire texture of daily life. A Roman citizen possessed rights tied to civic standing, lawful marriage, recognized contract, and in earlier periods, political participation tied to property and rank. A slave, by contrast, stood under another man's authority rather than before the law as an independent person. Yet Rome also left a narrow gap through which ambition could be managed. Some slaves were permitted a small personal fund, a peculium, which might one day be used to purchase freedom. This was not compassion. It was administration through controlled hope. Rome governed not only with roads, taxes, and soldiers, but by turning legal status itself into a machine of order. Mourning in a Roman house did not begin with greeting, but with hierarchy. The door opened softly, the sandals of servants moved through the corridor, and every glance, spoken or unspoken, drifted toward the man who stood at the center of the household. The issue was not simply wealth, but legal power over others. In the Roman household, the paterfamilias, the father and master of the house, stood as the legal center of the family. Wife, slaves, and often several generations of descendants could live under his authority, while property itself was vested in him. The old power of patria potestas, the legal authority of the father, was so wide that the household became a miniature version of the Roman state. Rome did not need to stand in every room. It placed a smaller image of itself inside each home. And in that design lies one of its most enduring lessons. Empires endure when they teach people to practice order before the state even arrives. Once you step beyond the threshold and into the forum, another question emerges. Who is truly recognized as belonging to the political community? In Rome, citizenship was never just an honorific title. It was a package of concrete legal capacities. A citizen might possess recognized marriage rights, legal contract rights, and admission into the civic order by birth, grant, military reward, or imperial favor. In communities holding Latin rights, many of these benefits could be enjoyed even before full Roman citizenship was achieved. Rome did not rule only by force. It ruled by opening and closing the doors of belonging. The empire understood that legal access was one of the most powerful instruments of loyalty. A man did not merely live under Rome, he hoped to be admitted by Rome. And that is what made the system so durable. Privilege was not only inherited, but staged as something to be conferred by authority. Yet beneath that same sky, the enslaved walked through Rome as human beings whom the law refused to see in the same way. No chain had to rattle for the truth to be felt. Sometimes all it took was a pointed gesture, a wax tablet of tasks, or an owner's quiet command. The issue was not whether the work was light or hard, but that the enslaved person stood within the legal sphere of possession. In principle, the slave was treated as property, deprived of the legal standing that belonged to the free. Many were drawn into the Roman system through war, trade, or compulsion, as outsiders made useful to imperial order. Rome never concealed the importance of that line. It built one of the ancient world's most effective societies upon the distinction between liberty and dependence. That efficiency is part of the empire's cold legacy. Some systems become strong not by eliminating inequality, but by organizing it. Still, if we imagine all Roman slaves as existing only in coarse labor, we miss the deeper intelligence of the imperial machine. In wealthy Roman homes, the scratch of a reed pen, the opening of account chests, and the counting of coins could matter as much as footsteps in the courtyard. Rome needed not only labor, but management. Many slaves and freedmen served as secretaries, tutors, accountants, stewards, and managers of estates. Children of elite households could even be educated by men who had once been owned. This reveals something crucial. Rome did not sort human beings simply into useful and useless. It assigned function according to the needs of power, while preserving strict differences in rank. A person could be indispensable to the operation of a great household and still remain socially inferior. That contradiction made Roman society remarkably flexible and remarkably hard. It is one of the oldest lessons of hierarchy. Those a system depends upon are not always those it honors. Beyond the city, under harsher light and across larger holdings, the question shifted from management to production. The drying of tools on wood, the smell of hot earth, and the regular rhythm of labor all revealed the same problem. Who made wealth grow? In the Middle Republic and into the Empire, large estates and productive enterprises often relied on enslaved labor and the work of freedmen. At the same time, many freeborn Romans of high standing considered direct manual labor beneath their dignity. This was more than social prejudice. It was an economic arrangement. The elite preserved status through command, while the dependent produced value through work. Rome thus turned hierarchy into an engine of output. Wealth moved upward, honor remained above. It is a pattern later societies would repeat in other languages. Labor and prestige do not naturally travel together, and systems of rank often survive by keeping them apart. Yet Rome was practical enough to understand that people work differently when they can glimpse a future. In a storeroom scented with oil and dry timber, a small purse might be hidden away, not fully the property of the man who guarded it, yet not wholly beyond his reach. The issue was how to make dependence productive over time. One answer was the peculium, a limited personal fund that some slaves could manage though it remained, in law, recoverable by the master. At times, that fund could become the path toward manumission. This was not generosity. It was governance through deferred possibility. Rome used hope as an instrument. It taught the dependent to work not only from fear, but from the belief that service might one day yield a different legal condition. Few techniques of power are more subtle than that. A system becomes stronger when it can persuade the subordinate that obedience may eventually open a door. The moment of manumission in Rome was never a clean leap into complete equality. A cord might be untied, a formal gesture made, a legal status altered, but the mark of dependence did not vanish with the ceremony. The issue was that Rome knew how to absorb change without dismantling order. When a slave was freed by a Roman citizen, citizenship could often follow, and for that reason the Roman freedman occupied a more visible social position than many formerly enslaved people elsewhere in the ancient world. Yet liberty did not erase memory. The freed person was not dropped into a world without structure. He was moved from one layer of the system into another. That was one of Rome's great political inventions. Instead of breaking hierarchy, it rerouted human lives through it. Freedom became not an end to order, but a different place within order. Even after freedom, old ties remained. In the soft light of morning, when the houses of the powerful opened for daily visits, many new relationships were only old ones rewritten in gentler terms. Rome did not favor social rupture. The patron-client system allowed men of influence to protect those beneath them while converting dependence into loyalty and status. A freed slave commonly became the client of his former master. The bond changed shape, but not entirely substance. Law and custom alike recognized this relationship, and over time it became hereditary and socially expected. Rome preserved the usefulness of attachment even after bondage formally ended. Freedom, then, was not always severance. It could be a regrade dependence, one more honorable in appearance, yet still ordered by inequality. That is why Roman society feels so modern in one unsettling respect. Power often survives best when it softens its language without surrendering its structure. There were doors in the empire that only noble birth could open, yet there were also doors that opened for those who had once stood at the bottom. In the corridors of imperial administration, the rustle of documents and the sealing of official letters might be handled by men who had once been slaves. Rome's central government needed competence as much as pedigree. Under Claudius in particular, imperial freedmen could hold striking administrative importance, functioning as secretaries and managers at the heart of the emperor's household and bureaucracy. This did not make Rome egalitarian. On the contrary, it showed how ruthlessly practical Roman power could be. It was willing to elevate talent from below, so long as loyalty flowed upward. The empire could despise low origin and exploit low origin at the same time. That tension lies at the core of its administrative brilliance. Rome rewarded usefulness without ever fully surrendering hierarchy. Even the task of protecting the city from fire reveals how Rome used status to run an empire. After a blaze, with smoke embedded in cloth and the sound of water slamming onto stone, a city learns quickly whether order is merely ceremonial or truly organized. Augustus understood that a metropolis could not survive on improvisation alone. He established a professional fire brigade and night watch, the vigiles, composed largely of freedmen. This choice was deeply revealing. The state turned men who had once stood in dependency into guardians of urban stability. Freed status did not remove them from service. It redirected them into one of the city's essential functions. Rome's genius was not that it made all men equal, but that it assigned nearly every status a use. In that design, usefulness itself became a civic language, and social rank became one of the tools by which the city preserved itself. Public religion also fell within the same logic. In temple courtyards, where incense drifted under the porticos and official prayers were spoken aloud, not every figure near the altar was born into ancient nobility. Rome needed a ritual order broad enough to gather many kinds of people beneath one system of reverence. In urban neighborhoods, cults associated with emperor worship could involve freedmen in meaningful roles, while local elites in the provinces used ritual display to bind loyalty to imperial order. Here again, the empire revealed its subtle intelligence. Men of lower origin could be granted symbolic dignity in public religion without disturbing the hierarchy that framed it. Rome knew how to bestow ceremonial honor in exchange for political attachment. This is one of the empire's most sophisticated arts, giving visibility to the subordinate without surrendering the superior order that defines him. If one looked only at armies and magistrates, one might think Rome was held together by force and statute alone. But every morning there was a softer ritual that stabilized society no less effectively. The knock at a door, the calling of names, the pause in the entrance hall, these gestures belonged to the salutatio, the morning greeting by which men of lower standing came to pay respects to their superiors. The real challenge of Roman society was how to preserve rank without constant coercion. Patronage answered that problem. Men of lesser status received protection, recommendation, and sometimes material aid. Men of greater status accumulated influence, obligation, and visibility. The result was a social order in which dependence could appear almost natural. Rome did not merely enforce hierarchy. It taught hierarchy to perform itself every day in gestures so ordinary that they came to feel permanent. Yet not every form of association among the lower orders was political in the obvious sense. Often, people gathered simply to survive the scale of empire with some structure of belonging. In the streets at dusk, amid cheap meals, dim lamps, and modest shrines, one sees a basic human need, not only to live, but to belong. Rome's collegia, associations for burial, trade, worship, or mutual support, answer that need. They could hold collective property and provide social stability to those who stood far from the top of society. Yet emperors also watched them carefully. Any association strong enough to organize people could become a source of disorder. So Rome permitted collective life, but only within managed limits. This was another mark of its intelligence. It allowed subordinate solidarity, so long as that solidarity did not rival the center. The empire could tolerate connection, but never competition. As Rome expanded, the question was no longer only who counted as a citizen in the capital, but how distant communities could be persuaded to live inside Roman forms. Beyond the city walls, roads, forums, theaters, and local councils created the impression that power had been translated into architecture. The challenge was to govern distance. Municipal systems and locally organized communities allowed towns to conduct much of their own life while local elites oversaw finance and politics within Roman frameworks. This encouraged Romanization not always by force, but by aspiration and imitation. Rome conquered softly when it could. It gave local communities structured forms into which they could step, and in doing so turned provincial administration into a ladder of belonging. The empire endured because it understood that a system can spread more efficiently when people are invited to inhabit it themselves. The army, too, became a place where the line between outsider and insider could be renegotiated through service. The stomp of nailed sandals on packed earth, the smell of leather and metal, the standard moving in the wind at a frontier post, all of it expressed the same truth. Discipline could produce identity. Rome needed loyal manpower across an immense space. For many, military life became a road into the civic body. Legionaries were citizens, while service and auxiliary units could eventually bring citizenship as a reward, especially under the empire. Thus the military did more than defend borders. It manufactured Romans in legal form. Some men were born into belonging, others earned their place through obedience and service. Here Rome revealed one of its enduring techniques. It turned the state into something a person might enter through discipline, not only inheritance. At last, the empire made a decision that blurred one of its oldest boundaries. In petitions, inscriptions, and legal records across the Roman world, the distinction between citizen and non-citizen began to fade. The problem was practical as much as political. Once citizenship had already spread so widely, keeping it rare no longer served Rome as efficiently as before. In 212, the edict associated with Caracalla, the Constitutio Antoniniana, extended Roman citizenship to nearly all free inhabitants of the empire. It was at once generous in appearance and strategic in effect. Rome unified the free population of its empire under a common legal name. Yet legal expansion did not dissolve inequality. The empire had widened the category of belonging, but it had not abolished rank. Rome was too experienced for that. Once an old distinction weakens, the durable system simply finds another language in which to preserve order. And that is precisely what happened. When the line between citizen and non-citizen grew faint, another division emerged, closer, colder, and sharper in its consequences before the courts. In the sound of testimony and the scratch of clerks' pens, not every citizen was treated alike. Rome still required a mechanism of differentiation. Increasingly, the law emphasized the separation between the honestiores, the more respectable, and the humiliores, the lower orders. Men of higher standing could expect more dignified treatment. Men of lower standing were more exposed to degrading or harsher penalties. Rome had broadened citizenship, but not equality. This is one of the empire's most revealing lessons. Legal inclusion alone does not erase hierarchy. A strong system can preserve inequality simply by transferring it into a new classification and letting justice itself speak in different tones to different ranks. Under the same empire, then, two men bearing the same civic name could still leave a courtroom with very different fates. Light fell across the hem of the garment. Officials called names, and long before a verdict was announced, the room often seemed to know whose body the state would treat with more restraint. Rome did not place law on a flat and neutral plane. It tied law to social dignity. The distinction between honestiores and humiliores meant that status shaped not only prestige, but punishment itself. This is where the phrase, under the same empire, reveals its deepest contradiction. Citizenship could be shared, yet the legal worth of a person's body remained unequal. Rome did not merely distinguish between persons in abstract categories. It attached hierarchy to flesh, to suffering, to the very way the state touched. To understand how Rome sustained such distinctions, we must return to one of its deepest legal inventions. The empire did not operate with one single law for everyone. On a magistrate's table, beneath written formulas and official declarations, law functioned first as a system of classification. Rome needed rules strict enough for citizens, yet flexible enough for foreigners, trade, and empire. The just civil belonged to Roman citizens. The just gentium developed as a broader law of peoples, one that could regulate dealings between Romans and non-Romans. This was not mere technicality. It was a method of governing a vast and mixed world. Rome asked what kind of person you were before it asked what kind of claim you made. The empire endured because it could sort human beings legally before it judged them morally. It is one of the oldest forms of administrative power and one of the most persistent. Power in Rome did not live only in soldiers, governors, or judges. It also lived in stone, in names, in inscriptions cut into public memory. On tombs, altars, and civic monuments, Latin appeared as both language and badge. Rome understood that law becomes stronger when people can see themselves reflected in its symbols. The growth of Latin inscriptions across the empire expressed not merely literacy or commemoration, but pride in Roman belonging and civic identity. To mark a name in Roman form was to place a life within the framework of the imperial order. Citizenship did not exist only in courts and decrees. It entered family memory, burial practice, and public honor. The empire became durable because it persuaded people to remember themselves in its language. Law in Rome was never only a system of rules. It was also a system of recognition, and recognition is one of the strongest bonds any state can create. Even so, Rome rarely flung open every door at once. It preferred gradations, intermediate statuses, and carefully measured steps upward. In allied cities and provincial communities, legal life existed in shades. The challenge was to make Rome attractive without making admission effortless. Latin rights offered one such middle stage, allowing communities or individuals to enjoy significant legal benefits, especially in marriage and commerce, before attaining full Roman citizenship. This transformed privilege into a political horizon. Rome did not merely hand out rewards, it designed ladders. Communities could advance toward fuller inclusion by entering Roman structures more deeply. That was one of the empire's most effective tools of integration. It trained local elites and populations to seek Rome not only as ruler, but as destination. A system becomes especially powerful when those outside it begin to measure their future by their distance from its center. In private life, the divide between freedom and slavery appeared even in what seems most intimate, the family. A household could share the same lamplight, hear the same child crying in the night, and live under the same roof. Yet the law did not recognize every attachment equally. Rome protected social order even within emotional life. Lawful marriage required legal capacity. For the enslaved, bonds resembling marriage could exist socially, but the owner's power limited their full legal recognition. Affection could be real. Legal standing was something else. This is one of Rome's most severe truths. The ability to love did not guarantee the right to have that love fully acknowledged by law. Here the empire's social structure revealed itself with painful clarity. Rome was not content to rule property and politics alone. It also determined which human bonds could stand with full dignity before the legal order. Even among the freeborn, not all stood equally close to power. In the crowded streets of imperial cities, poor free men, immigrants, and freed persons moved beneath the same awnings, heard the same vendors, and chased the same uncertain livelihood. Yet legal freedom did not automatically produce social security. By the 2nd century, Rome contained large numbers of freedmen and immigrants from across the empire. Most were poor, though a few imperial freedmen could become wealthy and conspicuous. This reminds us that the division between slave and citizen, though fundamental, was not the only line that mattered. One could leave bondage and still enter a new landscape of insecurity. Rome was not a world of simple opposites. It was a world of steps, layers, and uneven thresholds. Freedom changed a life, but it did not guarantee ease, honor, or equal access to the upper levels of society. What made Rome formidable was not merely that it distinguished between people, but that it made those distinctions appear reasonable, almost natural. The noble stood on the threshold receiving morning callers, the lesser man bowed, the freedman returned to the house of his former master as client rather than slave. Such scenes did not always look violent. That was precisely the point. When power becomes ritualized, it grows quieter and often more durable. From the authority of the paterfamilias to networks of patronage and associations kept within limits, Rome transformed relationships of dependence into forms of accepted social behavior. The law did not always need to intervene directly. People had already learned the shape of the order and how to live inside it. That is why the empire could contain slave and citizen, freedman and noble, without collapsing under the weight of its own inequalities. It had trained hierarchy into habit. And if there was one place where that power was laid bare, it was the city itself. Rome was not merely a landscape of monuments. It was a machine in which every rank was assigned a role. Freeborn citizens held civic dignity. Freedmen might serve as firefighters, administrators, ritual officials, or clerks of the imperial household. Slaves might keep accounts, educate children, and manage estates for others. The issue was never fairness. It was function. Rome did not erase difference. It organized difference. That is why the question of how slaves and citizens lived under the same empire has no comfortable answer. They inhabited the same physical world, but not the same legal altitude. Rome turned inequality into invisible infrastructure. Roads, walls, laws, houses, and customs all worked together to sustain a hierarchy so deeply embedded that it could feel ordinary even to those burdened by it. From that angle, Rome was not simply an empire that happened to include slavery. It was an empire that knew how to convert legal status into a technology of governance. In the turning of ledgers, the strike of tools, and the prayers before imperial cult images, every person participated in one imperial order, but from a position already defined. Rome's durability did not rest upon equality. It rested upon the art of arranging inequality. Citizenship could be extended strategically. Manumission could be offered without severing dependence. Lower status could be used to operate some of the empire's most necessary institutions. When unity was useful, Rome widened rights. When distance was useful, Rome created new rankings. That is why the empire did not dominate by military force alone. It ruled by classification. And classification, once accepted, becomes one of the most efficient forms of power any civilization can wield. In the end, the deepest Roman legacy in this story lies not in the number of slaves or citizens, but in the habit of thinking of law as an architecture of status. Whenever a magistrate pronounced the correct title, rank, or civic standing, he was speaking from a world that had learned to govern by classification. Many later societies imagine that they inherit Rome chiefly in roads, arches, armies, or public works. Yet one of the greater inheritances lies in the notion that a state can distribute rights according to legal identity and social place. Roman law would echo through much of Western civilization long after the Western Empire itself had fallen. That is why the comparison still matters. When modern societies argue about citizenship, belonging, and unequal access to justice, they are not merely studying Rome. They are continuing a conversation Rome helped design. So when we say that slaves and citizens lived under the same empire, we should not picture two groups simply standing side by side on the same road. It is better to imagine a many-story building, one roof, one stone frame, one set of echoing hallways, but each level open to a different kind of life. Rome's central achievement was not that it solved injustice. It was that it made injustice function so efficiently that many who live inside it could call it order. From the authority of the paterfamilias to citizenship, to conditional freedom, to the later distinction between honestiores and humiliores, Rome built a world in which law both gathered and separated human beings. That is why its shadow still falls across political thought in the West. And that is why, whenever a modern nation asks who truly belongs inside the civic house and who remains only at the threshold, Rome returns, quiet, disciplined, and never entirely gone.